What's up, Aventis fam? Welcome to the podcast series Aventis Knows. You are now listening to the 5th episode of this podcast, Aventis Knows Season 4. This show is brought to you by Aventis Learning Group, and I'm your host, Jing Han. And if you are an individual who's trying to find your way around the corporate ocean or trying to hashtag up your game with your career, this is where you should be. In today's episode, we will be discussing the topic of how do we ace emotional intelligence interviews. I would say that the fear does not really come much from the interview itself, but rather it is the unexpected questions that we might be asked that tends to get us worried. Basic questions around our skills and experience are generally easier to answer, but what about the questions like, how good are you at asking for help? Or how do you create balance in your life? These questions are a bit more personal, and they are not seeking to catch you out, but they are seeking to understand your emotional intelligence. These are what we refer to as soft skills, and they are bonus points quality that candidates can bring to the table. These traits help to explain how well you work with others, whether you can communicate effectively with clients and teams, or if you have the capability to bring more to the table. However, during interviews, we tend to focus more on our areas of expertise and the special skill sets that companies are looking for in their job description. But we need to be aware that almost every single person applying for the job has similar qualities and expertise. So, what sets us apart from the other candidates? How can we better demonstrate our emotional intelligence during the interviews? Let's bring in our speaker, Rahul Shah, to enlighten us more on this topic. Rahul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
Should we practice or memorize answers? Because I believe we can find emotional intelligence questions online.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think it's always good, it's like a 10-year series, go and find as many questions as you can. End of the day, a lot of HR folks also go online and find questions, I'm sure. So I think it's good, go ahead. If you have friends in the organization, ask them what were they asked when they went for the interviews in a company. Because LinkedIn is a very good friend, right? Go and make connections. So if you know you're going to interview a particular company, try to see whether you can get in touch with some people from that company. If you don't have friends already, then go onto LinkedIn, find people, message them and say, hey, I'm actually coming in for an interview in a week's time or 2 weeks' time. I thought I could do with some help or guidance from you. These are my questions. Would you be able to help me answer? So you can ask them beforehand when they went for interviews what type of questions were asked to them, so that if you're lucky and they share, then you know what to expect, so you can prepare for it. So I think preparation is never a bad thing. What you do not want to do is you do not want to have a word-for-word memorization of it, because it just comes across very engineered. But always practice. The more practice you have in answering these questions, the more polished you'll be, the more confident you'll be, the more ready you'll be, right? So you won't be a nervous wreck, basically, right? So it's important that you are practicing how to answer these questions rather than specific answers, because every company and organization you go to, your answer is going to be tailored to some extent. So you do not want to fall into that trap of having a one-size-fits-all kind of a response either. Yeah.
When we answer emotional intelligence questions, are there any right or wrong answers?
There's a beauty of emotional intelligence questions. There's never a right or wrong answer. The wonderful thing about emotional intelligence itself is that till date, I think the first time we came across the term emotional intelligence was in 1990, right? So we're looking at 10, 20, 30 years almost, right? So 30 years of emotional intelligence, and we don't yet have a world-recognized psychometric testing tool for emotional intelligence, right? So there's no way that there's going to be a right or wrong answer to emotional intelligence questions in that case. So it's usually open-ended. It's a lot of times dependent on how the interviewer also perceives and receives the responses that you're giving. So the only thing you can do is do the best that you can, be real, observe the interviewers at all times, make sure you are picking up their cues. Are they smiling? Are they nodding? Are they looking at you? Are they distracted? Do they keep looking at their watch? Are they being impatient? Are they tapping the table? So the expressions, keep a lookout for it. Be observant towards it, and then tweak and adjust your responses along the way, so that you are able to engage them better. So the more you are able to engage them, the better they'll walk away feeling about that particular interview. And that's what you want.
Are there any specific emotional intelligence interview questions for leaders?
Yes, there are. Questions like, what are your plans in the next 5 years, right? They want to see foresight, they want to see vision, they want to see the ability to plan ahead, strategize, right? So 5 years. There's another question that is often asked: if you were to start your own business, what would be the top values for your organization, right? So the business leaders, they want to see your ability to craft values, to be able to drive a values-driven team, which I think is essential for any leader in the organization, right? So there are specific questions for leaders. A lot of them are high-level questions. Another question is, how would you manage disputes within your teams, for example, right? So that's another question, because as a leader, you're often in a situation where you are going to be handling people from different backgrounds, with different dynamics, different issues. How are you going to be able to manage those differences amongst your team and keep a harmonious team without it all falling apart, right? So those are the kind of questions that you'll find in a leadership kind of interview, where it's more driven towards managing people, keeping relationships intact, having a vision and foresight, being able to relate to goals, values, and directions, right? So that's the kind of questions that leaders can expect to come across.
So I happen to come across a term called stress interview, but I'm not really sure what it means. Could you help me out a bit on that?
So stress interviews are sometimes things where they want to create a pressure cooker kind of an environment for you, right? So I was working with one of the companies, and one of the processes they have is they'll bring in 10 candidates, right? And they'll basically ask questions, and for every question, only one candidate gets to answer. So whoever's the first candidate to respond to the question is theirs, right? So it just helps to filter out those who cannot keep up, cannot cope, cannot get their voices out, right? So you may have the greatest ideas, but if you're not going to be able to speak up, if you can't articulate, if you're not confident, if you're not fast enough, if you're not agile enough, then it's a shortcoming. Thankfully, it was not the only component of the interview. It was one of the components, right? So I'm sure there were other areas where they could have fared well, but this was one of the situations where it's a stress interview, right? Because they're trying to create a pressure cooker kind of a setting, a pressure cooker kind of environment, where they want to see how do you respond to that stress. Another thing that they often ask participants, interviews to do nowadays, is say, okay, you got 20 minutes, I want you to quickly come up with a 1,500 word essay, right, on a particular thing, on why we should hire you, for example. How on earth do I come up with a 1,500 word essay of why you should hire me, right? Like, I love myself, but not so much, right? So that's another stress interview. They basically want to see how you're able to cope with it. They're giving you a very generic question. They're giving you a very tight time frame of 20 minutes. They're giving you this impossible word count of 1,005. The trick behind that really is not to fall into the trap of giving them 1,005 most of the time. The 1,005 will come, all right? But it's to first create a logical flow of your thoughts, right? To organize your thoughts in a logical manner, to make sure you identify what the key messages and the key points out, and how are you going to present and sequence out those key points and those key positions, so that regardless of how many words it eventually turns out to be, you have, number one, in case you run out of time, you have already put forward your most important points first, and they're compelling points. You're able to substantiate those points in a concise, crisp, but a clear manner, right? And the third thing is that you have been able to provide enough elaboration, right, and not be tempted to just fill in the words with nonsense just to make up the word count, because they're going to look at, have you been able to pick up what the priority here is, all right? So 1,500 words, why should we hire you in 20 minutes? I think the priority here is first and foremost why you should hire me. The second priority is I want to give you as much reason as I can in this 20 minutes. My last priority is to pick up to 1,500 words. Right? But if you were to swap all that around, obviously the hirer is going to look at it and say, okay, your priority was 1,500 words, so it was form over substance. Right? And that's not what we want. Right? So it's a stress interview again, it's a stress test again, where they just want to see, are you able to, under stress, keep your sensibilities intact? Right? Are you able to keep your abilities to think right intact? Are you able to keep your priorities in check? All right? Or are you going to be all over the place? So it's because you're stressed out. So I think they have these stress interviews in different forms, in different formats. So to keep your mind clear is very important.
That's very new and sounds very scary to me. How do we then prepare for one, or like how do we stay calm for one?
Read, pause, think and reflect, and then act. It's a very simple 4-step process to managing stress, right? So always identify the thing first, breathe first, all right? Make sure you got enough oxygen going up to your brains, so you're not depriving your brain of oxygen to think clearly. Pause, reflect and think, all right? And then plan your response. Right? Don't respond before planning your response. I still remember when I was in national service, my officers always used to tell me, a failure to plan is a plan for failure. All right? So same thing, our responses must be planned. There has to be a strategy. So in presentation skills, we always teach how to have a storyboard. So same thing in an interview response, have a storyboard. What's my starting point? What's my middle? What's my end? How am I going to create this journey of response so it's logical and sensible? Use 𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗲 again if you need to help yourself with that. Right? It's a very useful tool. If I got 10 points I want to make, I repeat 𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗲 10 times. Right? It's a very, very logical tool. It's a very simple tool, which is why I keep harping on it, because I think in an interview what you need is a clarity of thought. So a framework like that helps provide you the clarity of thought. Some other ways of organizing your responses could be problem solution. Right? Lay out the problem, define the problem first. What is the problem? How does this problem impact everyone around me? What could be the solution? Why should it be the solution? Right? If you can provide that kind of a roadmap to your response, that helps again. Another good format to use is a multiple point of views format, where you find 3 different points of views and say, okay, from my point of view, from the organization's point of view, from the industry point of view. Right? How does this benefit each of us? How does it benefit me? How does it benefit the organization? How does it benefit the industry as a whole? Or how does it benefit your customers or your clients? Right? So you find 3 different stakeholders and discuss something from that point of view. Right? So that's again another thing that can guide us. So you start off by saying there are 3 points of views I'd like to discuss here. Right? The first, the second, and the third. So let's look at the first one. Right, and you talk about it. Let's look at the second one, you talk about it. Let's look at the third one, you talk about it. Right, so that's the third. Another good framework to use is the timeline framework. Right? Anytime people ask you a why kind of a question or how kind of a question, it's sometimes good to go back into history for context and say in the past, previously, before this, right? This is how things were done, this is how things used to happen. In the current situation, the present situation, this is where we are. This is how we are doing this is how we are making things happen, this is how people are doing things. Moving forward, this is where the world is going to. So this is what I would like to see. This is what the organization should be doing. Right? So you talk about the future. So a timeline sequence is another great sequence for you to organize your thoughts into, to guide you into having a great response. So I think having some of these tools in your pocket that you can pull out at any one point in time equips you the confidence to say, okay, I got this, right? I got something to guide me through this. So keep that in the back pocket, use them as necessary.
I also came across a recent survey conducted by 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 that it found out that 4 out of 5 professionals reported feeling uncomfortable by interview questions that they were asked, and most of them didn't know that they shouldn't be asked these type of questions in the first place. So are there any off-limits questions that interviewees should not be answering, and how do we avoid these questions in a professional manner?
Yeah. So I came across a story by a friend some time back where he attended an interview, and he's a person of a Sikh faith, right? So in Sikhism they keep their turbans and they keep their beards, and he was applying for a customer facing role, And during the interviewer asked, so should we hire you? Would you be comfortable in shaving your beard to go for a cleaner look? So I think it's one of those questions where, so he felt very uncomfortable. He left, and he shared his experience on Facebook, and it became quite an issue. But I think it's one of those things sometimes where, the interviewer may not be familiar with certain cultures. They may not be sensitive to it sometimes, or sometimes it's ignorance, right? So I think there can be a few ways on approaching this. Number one, you, instead of walking away entirely, if you do like the organization, you feel that this organization does have prospects, if you sense that it's not coming from a place of hostility, or it's not being done on purpose, right? Take that opportunity to, number one, express your discomfort, put forward why you're uncomfortable in a constructive, objective manner without getting emotional. And then if you think that there's a necessity to, or there's a room to, you can try to educate the other party. So, sometimes there's certain comments made about gender, dressing. I think those things are not about education. There's things a lot of times about calling it out and pointing it out. But sometimes if it comes to insensitives about race, backgrounds, things, sometimes about education qualifications. Sometimes you may have a qualification which the interviewer may not really see, or the recruiter may not really see how it has a direct link back into the position you're applying to. Those things create an opportunity to educate, to share, to enlighten. Because you may have done a minor, right? Although your primary degree is, or your major is something else, but you may have done a minor that gives you some amount of familiarity with what the job scope requires, and that minor has not come across very clearly on your resume. So it's to point it out and say, yeah, I do have a minor in this. It was an extensive minor, although it's called a minor. I did do an entire 6 modules. So at the end of the day, I think I do know something about this. It's not like coming in fresh, right? Sometimes, for example, you may not have a programming degree, you may not have an IT degree, but you have done your own certifications, right? In Python, in C++, or whatever other languaging that you're using. So you may have done your own certifications, you may have been practicing, you may have been a hobbyist who does your own coding and programming. So, share those experiences. Take the time to educate people. It's not that they want to discriminate, sometimes they just don't see it, right? Maybe they have never come across this before. A lot of times the recruiters themselves are new, right? They might have been in that particular area for maybe a year, 2 years, so they don't have, it's not necessary they've been around for 20 years, 30 years. So it's important that we understand where that comment, that question is coming from, what's the place of source, and then to respond to it in a constructive, objective manner. Right, number one, express that you're uncomfortable, share why, and then if you see a room to educate, right, and share further, and then accept a follow-up question from them, which they could rephrase or reframe, or they might even skip the question and move on to something else. If you are not sure of where that question is coming from, seek to clarify. Right? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Can you put that in other words? Could you reword that for me a little bit? Right? Just give them an opportunity to. They may even ask you, why do you need me to reword it? It's quite straightforward. And that's when you explain, because how I'm perceiving the question is this. Am I right? Is that what you intend? And then let them clarify. Right? So it's good to sometimes, instead of confronting them, seek to clarify, seek to confirm, so that you make sure there's no misunderstanding here. All right? Or you also give them an opportunity to sometimes rephrase something that they may not realize, okay, that didn't come out right. Right? So practice active listening, practice parroting sometimes, reply back to them and say, I'm sorry, but what I heard was you saying this. Is that what you mean to ask? Because if that's the case, I may need you to reword this so I understand what you mean exactly. I'm not getting it right now. So as much as you don't want to come across overbearing, it's good to be a bit confident of yourself that this interview is as much of your journey as it is theirs. So own the room, right? Take ownership. You don't have to be the weaker person here. An interview is not a process of people between two different positions. It's an equal field. They are looking for someone. You have what they want, right? And so it's about a service purchaser and a service provider, right? So it's really an equal footing. Now the question is, do you come across as a good fit? That's what you're here to explore. So you don't have to really come and take a weaker position per se, right? So I think a bit of confidence, a bit of assertiveness can be useful, especially when you sense that what's being put towards you is a bit uncomfortable.
That's very helpful. Do you have any other examples of like instances where job interviews went wrong?
I think job interviews go wrong all the time. I remember a job interview that I went for at one time that went terribly wrong. I was half an hour late because it was raining extremely heavily. I didn't have an umbrella with me. I was caught completely off guard. I had the option of turning up for my interview presentable or turning up for my interview on time but wet. Right? And I chose to go for the interview half an hour late. So turning up at the interview half an hour late, the hiring manager was sitting there, the HR was sitting there. Thankfully there were other interviewees, so they were not exactly waiting for me. But I was given a time slot, so the guy was earlier for his time slot. He got called in first, I got called in after that, and they did make a comment about the time and says, well, I don't think you want time today, but let's get started so that we don't waste any more time. All right, so and then we went into asking the first question. So when the comment was made, I got a bit unfazed. I was very young. I was about 17 years old at that point in time. So I was already unnerved. In my head, I was thinking, this is gone, right? This is over. I don't have a chance here, because it sounded very intimidating. It sounded very annoyed. The posture was not right. The body language was very hostile. They were sitting back in the chair. They were not very interested. It was just almost as if they were going through a formality. So looking at all of that, I got very intimidated. And so the first question that they asked me was, tell us, how do you perceive the value of time? And this is for someone who has been late, right? And I started off my answer by just responding directly to the question. I didn't realize at that point in time, of course, 20 years after that, today I'll have a better response, right? Because today if someone asks you, I'm late for my interview, and this is the first question asked, how do I answer it? I'll tell them, well, first apologize, right, for being late. Get the cue, right? You're asking this question for a reason. So pick up the cue. So I was not so alert at that point in time. So I answered the question and said, time is very important to me. I'm someone who strongly believes in punctuality, and I didn't realize I was shooting myself in the foot, right? Because I was 30 minutes late. So that's an interview that went terribly wrong. Not a good interview at all. So I think be alert, pick up the cues, be aware, right? So that you stay on top of the interview. While you want to answer what's being asked of you, you also do want to direct the interview in a way that is favorable to you. So I would use this as an opportunity to answer, to give one more tip, to say that practice the whole art of share enough to make sure you're answering the question with substance, but leave out enough, right, to make sure that you leave something for curiosity and inquisitiveness. Because when you are able to create the curiosity, the follow-up questions remain relevant to what you want them to ask, right? So for example, if someone were to ask me, tell me a time when you encountered failure and how did you deal with it? So my answer to them would then identify a specific incident and says, there was a time when our team was assigned to do this particular project. The timeline was extremely tight, and we worked to our best abilities to ensure that we were able to fulfill that timeline. So we put in the extra hours, we worked overtime, we worked through weekends as well. Unfortunately, the scope and scale of the project was such that we were not able to fulfill the timeline, and therefore we actually lost out on the tender. On hindsight today, I could have had better conversations with my bosses and with my teammates, and we could have done extra things, like probably ask for additional resources, ask for additional headcounts, get more budgets in place, automate some of the processes, so that we are able to then fulfill the time requirements, which we did not see at that point in time. But on hindsight right now, it would have given us enough leverage to overcome the time frame. So that's basically an answer that I would typically provide, right? But if I want to leave something out where I want them to ask me a follow-up question, I would not go right away into that aspect. What I'll say is that this is a project that we're working on, these are hard struggles that we face. As a result of that, we were not able to meet the timeline, although eventually we did recover from it, and we still secured the project anyways. The question that comes to the interviewer's mind here is how? How do you recover? And I want them to ask me that question because that's an important question. I do not want to bury my how. I may not necessarily want to bury my how I recovered into my failure question, because I'm then joining together two things which are not in my favor. So I want to end off by saying that I did recover, but I'm not sharing how with you. You ask me how, then I share it, because then you're interested. Then I know you're listening to my how, my solution, my creativity, my genius, right? So I want that to come across to you. So you want to be mindful, what are you trying to sell here? When they're asking you about failure, focus on the failure. Tell them about what you could have done better, but don't tell them how you recovered. How you recover is a separate question. Get them to ask you that question. So drive that conversation, drive those interviews, so that instead of them just asking what they have on their paper, you're now able to generate enough curiosity for them to ask you what you would like them to ask you, right? So be a bit more alert to it as well.
So this question will be for HR managers or hiring managers out there. How should they structure their questions to improve their recruitment drive?
Very good. So I think first and foremost, keep questions open-ended, right? So I would say a lot of times, the last question, for example, tell me a moment where you encountered failure and how did you manage that incident? I think that's a very pointed question, right? So this question is good to ask later on in the interview. At the start of the interview, you want to ask very broad questions. Questions such as, how's your work experience, how's your work journey, how's your career journey been so far, right? This gives the interviewee more room to navigate their responses, and it gives you an insight into what do they organically find to be the highlights of their career. Rather than you guiding them, rather than you suggesting something to them, let them have that free space to pick whatever they want, right? So I think that's, so keep it as open as possible at the start of the interview process, because that's where you get to see the real shades, the real character. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, it's good to go into the more specific questions, the scenario-based questions, the hypothetical questions, the what-if questions. But when you're ending off the interview after that, I think a lot of times recruiters like to end off with, do you have a question for me, right? That's a great way to end off, but I think it can be other ways of ending off as well, where again you could give them an opportunity to share things about, so how would you like to contribute to our workplace, right? Or assuming you join our workplace, how would you like to spend the first 3 months, right? What would you be focusing on for the first 3 months? So I think those kind of questions are good to ask towards the end of the thing, because they have gone through this whole interview process. Now you're getting their frame of mind into the organization, getting a picture that assuming I've already completed this interview, I've passed this interview, I'm in the organization, what would I be doing? You get to understand what their priorities are, how would they be spending the first few days, what their motivations are going to be in the early days, are they driven by the correct things? Because if they say, oh, I want to spend time jumping straight into tasks and special projects, they are not coming from the right place, because they're even figuring out their relationships. They're not trying to understand what the department entails. They're not trying to build relationships with their colleagues. They're not trying to learn and grow, right? So you may want to pick up interview at the end with some of this kind of more open question that says, how would you spend your first 3 months in the organization? What would be your areas of focus, right? So I think those kind of questions are better. So start with open, go into specifics, and with more open questions.
Now finally, before we end this podcast session on how do we ace emotional intelligence interviews, could you leave us a take-home message for our listeners, or any golden rules that encourages you to keep going?
I strongly believe that emotional intelligence is a vital aspect or element of our personal and professional growth and development. So it's not something that we just focus on in preparation for interviews. I think it's something that I strongly encourage anyone listening to this podcast today to internalize this and apply a bit of it and practice a bit of this on a day-to-day basis. In every interaction or encounter that we have with our colleagues, with our peers, with our subordinates, with our leaders, with our family, with our friends, with our children. Practice this, right? Practice being aware of people's emotions and your own emotions. Practice using this awareness of our emotions and people's emotions to facilitate thinking. Use that ability to think from an emotional perspective to then respond in an emotionally sensitive manner, and then seek to understand what all of this really means. Right? So if you can do these 4 things on a day-to-day basis, you'll find that your ability to be productive at work, manage stress, manage relationships becomes vastly accelerated. So I would say that don't wait to just prepare for interviews, but practice this day in, day out.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for joining our podcast.
Thank you so much.
Hi Aventis fam, from this session, we now know that emotional intelligence, that is the savviness to be in tune with your emotions and others, can help you land that dream job. According to a LinkedIn analysis, EQ is one of the most in-demand skills of 2020. And as workplaces ramp up their focus on employee mental health and positive company culture, they are looking to hire new additions who can enhance this mission. I also want our listeners to know that emotional intelligence interview questions aren't designed to catch you out, make you feel dumb, or prevent you from securing the opportunity that you are after. They are great questions to use outside of any context to help you develop your self-awareness for emotional intelligence and also to uncover potential areas for your personal and professional growth. And with that, thank you for tuning in to the 5th episode of Aventis Knows Season 4. If you do have any questions regarding the topic of emotional intelligence interviews, do drop down your questions in the comment section below or drop us a DM. We are available on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, as well as Spotify. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to us for more podcast episodes, and we will see you soon. Bye!